Hello and welcome to the Daily Journal's Capitol View webcast. Where each week we talk about Mississippi politics with Daily Journal Capitol Bureau Chief Bobby Harrison. We are back for another week, and the legislature now enters week two. So I know we talked last week, Bobby. It's kind of a little slow in getting things going, but how's everything looking this week?
Well, still looking slow, Chris. The House did start taking up some transportation bills. There's a debate about how much, significance, how much difference those bills would make. But they passed 5 bills out of committee last week and took 3 of those bills up on the floor last week. And they're still just kind of getting started. And so we'll see what happens in the coming days.
Yeah, and so I'll take a step back. I flubbed the introduction and failed to introduce myself. I'm Chris Kiefer on Daily Journal, managing editor for multimedia. And again, each week we talk about Mississippi politics. Bobby's joining us down from the state capitol, where he is covering the legislature in session. But Bobby, I want to ask you specifically. You talked about the transportation stuff going on. On a slow week, and again, we talked last week about how things start slowly. The House Transportation Committee, I guess, passed 5 bills out of committee. And the whole floor of the House passed 3 of those. I know we'll kind of get into specifics, and as you wrote, I mean, none of those bills are very big. In and of themselves, they're not going to have a big impact. However, the fact that they're passing 3 bills in what's normally a slow week, is that a strong statement that transportation is going to be a major issue for the House this session?
Yeah, I think it is. I think that's the intent of passing those bills. The Senate, the House leadership wants to send a message that they want to do something this session in terms of passing legislation to deal with what many say is a deteriorating state and local transportation system. So that was a message that they sent. Even Charles Busby, the Republican lawmaker from the Gulf Coast who chairs the House Transportation Committee, said those bills that they took up last week are not going to solve all the issues surrounding transportation in the state, but he said they're a step in the right direction. And one bill, perhaps the most significant of those bills is just a simple bill that provides $50 million in bonds,
right,
to deal with bridge needs on the local and on the city and county level. And that was a bill that they took up and passed out of that bill actually came out of the House Ways and Means Committee, and they passed it on the floor later in the week. And then the other two, another bill deals with providing a percentage of the state revenue growth to transportation needs. Now, the problem with that bill is there just hadn't been much revenue growth in recent years. So, the trend continues. There may not be any money there whatsoever. And then the third bill deals with saying the Department of Transportation has to focus solely on dealing with maintenance needs and not building any more new highways unless those highways are already sort of in the pipeline, if you will. And critics of that bill say that the transportation officials already are doing that. They're directing all their money to maintenance needs, and there's just not enough money to deal with all the maintenance needs out there.
Yeah, and so I guess the other 2 bills that are still out there, one of them would divert some of the money from the use tax that's, I guess, growing as the Department of Revenue starts collecting from more and more online retailers. The other one would remove Department of Transportation officials from civil service, and so that they could kind of restructure the department a little bit. And again, those have only passed out of committee.
Right. Both those
before the House.
Yeah, and there's removing civil service protection is always sort of a controversial thing, and there's debate about whether that actually helps or makes things worse. But it seems, that's been a constant theme of the Republican leadership has been a consistent supporter for moving civil service protection for state employees, and so that bill's out there. And then the other bill would take a portion of the sales tax collected on a voluntary basis by online retailers and divert that to the transportation department. Now, there's a debate about how much money that's going to be and whether that would be enough money to make any difference whatsoever. There's some arguments that as it would work out, it really wouldn't divert any money to transportation. We just had, we just had to see how that plays out. But the first $50 million would stay with the general fund and not go to transportation. And then a portion of between $50 million and $250 million would be diverted to transportation. And there's a question about whether there's going to be online retail, voluntary online retail collections of more than $50 million coming to the state. So we'll just have to see.
Yeah, and so of course the needs are big. Department of Transportation has said it would take about another $400 million annually to deal with all the road and bridge repair needs that Mississippi has. And as you've written many times, there's generally a consensus among legislators that those needs are real and need to be addressed quickly. The problem has long been finding any money for it. And this is the first session that this was a major issue going into the session, but just not a lot of actions happened. Which again, I guess put some extra symbolism on the House taking the step in the first week. There were some who were critical of the move. I know Representative Steve Holland basically just said, "Hey, this is just a Band-Aid. I mean, let's do some real change." I'm paraphrasing, rather than just kind of these minor changes. I mean, what do you think? Again, you've said that this isn't what would really move the needle. I mean, what else do you see coming from the House? Do you think that this is kind of just the beginning of a wave of bills, or where do you see the temperature?
Yeah, Chris, that's such a good question, but I just don't have a good answer for it.
Right.
The primary source of state revenue for Department of Transportation is the 18.4 cent per gallon gas tax on motor fuel, primarily on gasoline, of course, and that just is not a growing source of revenue. Because cars are more efficient. They get a lot more miles per gallon than they did in 1987 when that tax was imposed. So it's just not a growing source of revenue, but there seems to be no will whatsoever amongst the legislative leadership to increase the gasoline tax. Now, one would be a small source of revenue, but it'd be a growing source of revenue, and it's something that it's editorializing a little bit that the state needs to consider is the fact that there's going to be more and more electric cars and other cars that run on things for fuel ways other than through gasoline. And right now, those cars are not paying any tax, any type of use of tax to use the roads. At some point, the legislature needs to address that issue, and that would be a small source of revenue right now, but it would be a growing source of revenue. As there's going to be, if you read those, magazines that look at those types of things, there's going to be more and more electric cars and hybrid cars on the road. So that's something that needs to be considered. But I just think the major issue that's going to come out of this session will be some bonds to build highways and perhaps improve bridges, but it won't, it would be relatively speaking, a Band-Aid and won't solve all the issues. But I just don't know. Right now I can't see what's going to come out of the session other than that. But who knows? It may fool me.
Yeah, and I guess the other question is, no matter what the House does and what they did this past week, and depends on what happens on the other side of the hall, and I guess, and what the Senate does. Last year the House, of course, had passed a couple of bills that would have brought more revenue, and I guess the main one would have been, again, diverting some of that use tax money from online sales collections, and that would have gone towards roads and bridges. The Senate didn't agree. Where do you see the appetite in the Senate right now on this issue? Is it less than in the House, or is that also going to be a roadblock, do you think?
Well, I don't know if, I just heard a speech by Tate Reeves, the Lieutenant Governor, presides over the Senate, and he said that the Senate hopes to produce some additional revenue for roads and bridges this year, but he wouldn't say where that revenue is going to come from. So you're asking good questions. I just don't have good answers.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Switching gears then, Bobby, from that issue, and obviously I know it's one we've talked about a lot, and maybe as the session goes on there'll be more clarity. But the other main action of last week, I guess, was the new committee assignments. And as we talked again on this program last week, with so much turnover, and I think there were six new seats in the legislature this year that opened up some spots on new committees. The biggest of those committees was the House Education Chair, and Speaker Philip Gunn named that last week. Gulf Coast Representative Richard Bennett. Tell us a little bit about him.
Well, he's a Republican. He was chairing a gaming committee, so he was. As you recognize his name, it's probably, he headed up the lottery committee lottery study committee that Speaker Gunn formed over the summer. He headed that up, so his name was in the news a good bit there. He also was, incidentally, he was last during the 2017 session when there was work being done to rewrite the school funding formula, a controversial thing. The Speaker Gunn said that Bennett was going to head that up instead of the then House Education Chair, John Moore. So when John Moore resigned, it really was no surprise to anyone that that the Speaker named Bennett as the Education Committee Chair. He's a former school board member. He has a number of relatives who are involved in education on the Gulf Coast. The word is that some of the school choice groups were not thrilled with his appointment, that they don't know if he's going to be as supportive of some of the school choice initiatives as some other legislators who might have been in line for that committee appointment would have been. So he was, and generally speaking, the public, when I say public education supporters, I'm talking about the traditional public education groups. They were supportive of the Bennett appointment, so we'll see what that all means. But he has a long background in public education on the Mississippi Gulf Coast.
Yeah, I noticed Nancy Loom of the Parents Campaign, which is a public school advocacy group, had sent out an email, supporting his, I guess, nomination, or him being the education chairman. So I was kind of wondering what some of the buzz was. Bobby, you also you noted the fact that he was over or I guess kind of appointed by Gunn to kind of head up some of the efforts on the funding rewrite. By him being named the Education Committee Chair, we've already talked about that seemed to be a main priority of legislative leadership. But is that even just another signal that that's kind of one of their biggest issues of this session? And by putting him on the committee was kind of done to try to help, or chairing the committee to try to help kind of speed that process up a little bit more?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, I do think that's a priority for both Philip Gunn, who presides over the House, and Tate Reeves, who presides over the Senate. I think they both want to rewrite the Mississippi Adequate Education Program, which is a program that provides state funds to local school districts based on a formula. I think they definitely want to rewrite that, and it's a controversial thing. When the MAEP was passed in '97, it was hailed as landmark legislation. It's been disappointing, the fact that the legislature has not funded it. And so there's a fear that, this rewrite is all part of a ruse, if you will, to pass legislation that would take the issue of full funding off the table. So it'd be controversial in the legislative process, and perhaps Richard Bennett might carry a little bit more weight with public education supporters than some of the other people that the Speaker could have appointed to that position.
Yeah. Switching gears again, Bobby, another story you had written about this weekend involved Oxford Representative Jay Hughes, a freshman, I guess in his first term of the legislature, but who seems to kind of be having more and more of a profile, I guess, in various issues. There's a lot of talk around the Capitol of him being a possible lieutenant governor candidate in 2019. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. I just wrote a story talking about he would face long odds if he ran, but he's sort of a brash individual in the sense that he's not afraid to stick his neck out, and so he may he may try to win the Democratic nomination for lieutenant governor. And of course, there's only one statewide Democrat out of the 8 statewide offices, so he had faced long odds, but he seems that if it appears just from his actions that he's running for something other than his current House seat in Oxford. And so, the lieutenant governor is the obvious post that he might run for.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, he seems to be pretty outspoken, maybe more so than most freshman legislators are, and just in
More
terms
so
of
than most legislators.
yeah, yeah, fair enough. And in terms of social media, you had written about the lawsuit he filed on the so-called demon chipmunk, but the speed of that computer reading program that they'll use when bills are asked to be read, and the trying to slow it down, I guess, and force the speaker's
Yeah,
hand to do
yeah.
that.
Yeah, that
Um,
lawsuit was just kind of an
yeah,
example of his brashness. Most members, especially freshman members, wouldn't challenge the speaker to that extent to file a lawsuit against him. But Jay Hughes didn't blink twice. He filed a lawsuit that he eventually lost, but it went all the way to the state Supreme Court, and kind of I think it kind of made the speaker at least a little mad. Though in my story, I lead the story talking about how they talk about how they're good buddies and they're former Ole Miss law school classmates.
Bobby, one question I was wondering on that, because of the unique situation where the lieutenant governor is basically presides over the state senate, has there been a situation before, and kind of how would that work? How difficult would that be right now with it being a heavily Republican controlled Senate? Just supposing a Democrat were to hold that office as lieutenant governor.
That's a very good question, Chris. And there's been instances before where you had going back to Phil Bryant's only term is, did he serve 2 terms lieutenant governor? No, he only served 1 term.
I'm not sure.
And during his term as lieutenant governor, at least when that term started, of course he's a Republican, and there was a Democrat majority in the Senate, and the lieutenant governor has considerable powers, but those powers are given to him based on the will of the Senate. The Senate votes to the Constitution makes him presiding officer, but essentially that all that means is that he presides over when the Senate's in chamber. But the Senate votes to give the lieutenant governor power to make committee assignments, to assign bills to committee, just all sorts of powers that the Senate could take away from him. There's always been speculation that you had a situation where you had lieutenant governor of one party and a large group of members from the other party that the Senate might vote to take those powers away from the lieutenant governor. So that could happen, and I mean there would be nothing to prevent that from happening, other than the tradition of the Senate. And I think there'd be some senators who would say, no, this is what we've been doing since anybody can remember. Given the lieutenant, somebody's got to be in charge. Lieutenant governor's elected statewide, so he should be in charge. But it doesn't. There's nothing in law that says that's the way it's got to be. So I think that would be a real issue if somebody like Jay Hughes or another Democrat such as George Flaggs was elected lieutenant governor, and it remained a sizable Republican majority in the Senate.
I'm assuming too that in running for lieutenant governor, he would not. You can't also run for he'd have to give up his House seat.
No, he didn't have to give it up, but he couldn't run for re-election.
That's what I'm saying. You couldn't cast your hat in both races, so you'd have to risk giving that up, which would be interesting. Given the odds of only one statewide elected Democrat. I guess I thought that would be an interesting part of the calculation. Probably looking ahead now, kind of week 2, and I know you said it would kind of be a couple weeks before things really got going. What do you kind of see on the hopper for this week? Maybe the biggest thing is the State of the State speech. That's tomorrow night, right? And is there anything big you're expecting out of that?
State of the State, we'll just see what what issues the governor has on his mind. He's talked a lot about school choice. He's talked about the lottery in the past, so we'll see what issues he had. He talked about this program to help send people to community college or whatnot to gain skills, not for a full 2-year program, but to gain skills for sort of a tech jobs that might take more than a high school education, but maybe less than a 2-year or 4-year degree. And we had the governor would speak Tuesday night, and I'm assuming sometimes this week the other 2 transportation bills that the House took up last week will come before the full chamber, and so we just have to see where it goes from there.
lastly, in looking back at the first week, we'll bring back something that we had done last couple of years on Capitol View. It's just kind of a couple of quick hits to rewind the week. And we had started, I'm making sure I get them all right. What most impactful legislator, strangest moment of the week, and most impactful legislation. And we'll start with the legislator. Who would you say was the most impactful legislator from the first week of the 2018 session?
Well, we already talked about him. I think, Richard Bennett went from a sort of a well-respected sort of mid-level member of the House to, he's education committee chair, and that's considered one of the key big committees. So he definitely was impactful getting that appointment from the speaker. So that's I would say Richard Bennett.
What was the strangest moment of the week?
Well, I mean, I think we talked about it last week, Chris. We came on late. When Steve Holland, he could probably take that title every week, but he comes to the well of the House, takes a point of personal privilege to say he doesn't have dementia anymore. So and he's
something that doesn't happen every day.
It doesn't happen every day. So Steve Holland, and I can probably just pencil Steve Holland in every week, but I try to have a different person each week.
Just for variety's sake.
Yeah.
What was the biggest bill of the week? Most impactful?
I mean, considering the only bills passed was a transportation bill, so I'd say in general those bills, we hadn't talked about it. Not a bill that hadn't been taken up yet. There's probably going to be several lottery bills filed, but there was a lottery bill filed in the Senate, and there's there was 38 members of the Senate, 38 members of the 52-member Senate, I think, signed a petition, if you will. I don't know if petition is the right word, but signed a letter committing to vote for that bill. So that's pretty significant in itself. That tells us that while the House and Senate leadership may not be for the lottery, there appears to be strong support amongst the members for a lottery. So we'll see where that goes. Yeah,
that'll be interesting to see kind of when that issue starts to get rolling, I guess. Anyway, that'll do it for another week of Capitol View. We remind you can catch us each Monday at 2:00 live at djournal.com. You can also catch the replay there as well as on the Daily Journal's Facebook page. So for Bobby Harrison, I'm Chris Kiefer. We thank you again for joining us, and we will see you next week.